Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Denison's latest session in our monthly webinar series called COVID-19's Impact on Organizational Culture, Trends and Stories from Benchmarked Data. I am Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's Marketing Manager, and I am thrilled to be joined by you all. As we give folks another moment or so to filter in, please test the functionality of the Q&A and chat features below and share where you are joining us from today. I encourage you to utilize these features throughout today's session, as I will be monitoring throughout to answer any quick questions, but I will also be looking through your questions to pose to our speakers at the end of the session when we have dedicated time for Q&A. Before I turn things over to our team, I'd like to briefly overview the Denison Consulting firm and what we do, introduce today's speakers, and highlight some of the topics we hope to touch on during today's discussion. First, I'd like to overview the Denison Consulting firm and what we do. Denison Consulting is a firm focused on large-scale culture transformation and leadership development, headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with a European office based outside of Zurich, Switzerland. Our global reach allows us to do work in over 50 countries and to develop our diverse research and diagnostics. Next, I'd like to highlight Denison's mission. Our mission is to improve organizational performance by developing corporate culture and leadership. Our global team of experts uses our set of diagnostic assessments, which are rooted in research, to provide transformation services to our clients. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Joining us today are Michael Schwundeman, Valerie Thomas, and Lauren Wegmeyer. Michael is Denison's Director of Research and Development. Michael joined Denison after working at Ford Motor Company on their talent analytics team, and his team here at Denison produces an immense amount of academic style research. He manages our product development and benchmarking and provides best-in-class data analytics for our clients. Valerie is Denison's VP of Consulting Services. She has over 20 years of experience working for Fortune 100 companies in HR and organizational development. Her experience managing large-scale change initiatives, coupled with her leadership coaching and performance management expertise, contributes to her success in leading companies through their culture transformation efforts. Lauren is an associate research consultant at Denison Consulting. She joined the team after starting her PhD in industrial and organizational psychology at Wayne State University. Her role at Denison includes conducting custom analytics for clients, preparing deliverables for clients and internal support documents, and aggregating research for culture and organizational outcomes. And lastly, hello, I am Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's Marketing Manager. I joined Denison after working as a marketing consultant for several mission-driven organizations, including the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, and Michigan's Fair Housing Center. At Denison, I work closely with every department to create and promote content that furthers the Denison brand and supports both our clients and our partners. The last thing I'd like to do before turning things over to Michael is overview some of the topics we hope to cover during today's session. Our team will be overviewing the culture trends we've seen emerge from our benchmarked data from the last year or so and how we can interpret these trends. We will also explore how and if these trends have played out with our clients, what insights we have gained from the last year, and what trends we'll be watching for in the future. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Michael to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Nellie, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're calling in from. Like Nellie said, we're going to dive into what trends we've seen in the benchmark data that we have for culture, as well as for some of the modules that we have. And Valerie's joined us to help speak to some of those client stories, bring to life some of these trends for specific examples. So I figured I'd start with giving a brief overview of our methodology, how we went about creating some of the data and some of the figures that you'll see today. So we started by downloading and cleaning the data and stretched back to January 1st, 2019, all the way through March 1st, 2021, to try to get a broad sense of what these trends look like over the past 2+ years. We narrowed this by only using the D48, our standard 48-item culture survey, and removed those that didn't have a sufficient number of respondents, which is at least 6 for private organizations, at least 25 for public organizations. So after removing a handful of organizations from that, we aggregated to the organizational level so that each of the data points and what you see is weighted equally for each of the organizations that we've included. So the data cleaning led to 136 organizations who closed their survey in 2019, 91 in 2020, and 36 in 2021. In addition to this culture data, we also reviewed data from our modules: engagement, commitment, innovation, trust. So just a few of our modules that we use, and using the same data cleaning processes. The total number of organizations from 2019 to 2021 for these modules ranged from 41 to 82. So a bit less robust than the culture data that we have. From there, we started the descriptive analysis to try to understand these trends, analyzing means, standard deviations, and percentiles across overall culture scores, traits, indexes, and item scores for each of the aspects of culture and the modules. Using this information, the data were visualized through some of the traditional reporting styles that you may be used to if you've used Denison before, the circumplexes, high-low item charts, as well as a few additional figures like line graphs to display those data trends over time. So to help set the context for the conversation that we'll have today, I wanted to include a timeline of some of the major factors that have happened over the past year plus during the pandemic. This became a pretty sobering task as the numbers were pretty startling when you actually look at them. So in January 2020, the US announced its first coronavirus case, and a few months later, the US had already hit 100,000 deaths due to the coronavirus. In September, that number was 1 million dead of COVID-19 worldwide. In March, it was officially declared a pandemic, and those are some of the more sombering notes. But there has also been an effort more recently to distribute vaccines very widely. So in July 2020, the DoD announced the vaccine distribution agreement. In December, the FDA approved its first vaccine, Pfizer's COVID vaccine, for emergency use. And since then, we've been steadily rolling them out in the United States and throughout the world to help fight the pandemic. So the data that we'll be looking at, mainly we were looking across 2020 and comparing it back to 2019 and seeing what the data trends looked like. So setting this context, here is the trend line that we see. So overall culture across 2019 fluctuated up and down between the mid to high 50s to 70th percentile. In the beginning of 2020, we saw it just about the same level, and then we saw it shoot up throughout the course of 2020. So you see that trend line rising from Q1 2020 to Q2 and Q3 as organizations really stepped up, and the culture of those organizations were strong in the face of the pandemic. People stepped up. And then in 2021, you see a bit of a dip, a bit of a decline back to what we saw back in 2019, as some of the looking ahead, there's some fear, some uncertainty about what culture is going to look like, what working is going to look like as the world opens back up, as offices open back up. Employees are wondering, are we going to be going back to the office? Are we going to be able to continue working remote? Essential workers are wondering, how long are we going to have the restrictions, the different ways of working that we have now? And so a lot of uncertainty. Here you'll see this broken out by each of the 4 traits within the Denison model. So involvement, consistency, adaptability, and mission. You'll see adaptability is one of those that has peaked during the pandemic, as you might expect. Organizations were forced to be adaptable in the wake of disruption that the pandemic has caused. And you see that peaking, especially in Q3, as organizations had found their footing during the midst of the pandemic and had made significant changes and settled into those changes in many ways. So again, what you'll see here at the onset of the pandemic, the first quarter of 2020, there was some fear, some confusion, some uncertainty, and scores were pretty much on par with what we saw in 2019. And then culture scores grew steadily throughout the year as organizations clarified and aligned around the new ways of working. From 2019 to 2020, the index that saw the most change, the most improvement, was creating change. And that was the strongest index of 2020 and the one that increased the most from 2019 to 2020. Creating change became a necessity for many organizations. The way they worked had to change. And we saw that reflected in the trends that we looked at. And then when we compared 2019 to 2020 as well, you can see that core values was lagging behind other areas. Percentile of 45 in 2019, percentile of 56 in 2020. So while we did see some improvement, it was still the lowest of each of those indexes across those 2 years, suggesting that maybe this was an area that organizations were struggling with, whether it was establishing and holding people accountable for the core values, or in the shifting of the pandemic and understanding how to react to the pandemic. And many organizations hit just a survival mode, trying to make sure that they could survive the pandemic, having to furlough employees in many cases, lay off employees in other cases, and shift the way they work. And core values may or may not have been top of mind during that time. And so we saw that lagging behind both in 2019 and 2020. So these, generally what we're seeing is something that surprised us at first. When we looked at this, culture scores generally got stronger as the pandemic hit. People were under a lot of pressure, but in many ways, it wasn't as surprising when we thought about it. In the face of a crisis, people stepped up, and the leadership in organizations asked a lot of their people to change the way they work, to work longer hours in many cases, to deal with many different policies and procedures. But the people stepped up within the organizations, and we saw that reflected in the culture. This was less surprising when we thought back to last summer when we were doing the resilience research. So at the onset of the pandemic in April, in March and April, we started offering a pro bono offering about resilience that included these 10 items that were scaled, and as well as a few open-ended items. And what we found is startlingly high percent favorable scores, higher than we've ever seen for any other survey that we've had. For a reference point, culture, you typically see anywhere from 35 to 60% favorable across the items within our culture survey. We saw 80s and 90s across many of these items. Again, evidence that organizations and the people in those organizations were stepping up in the face of the crisis. And so we see that in the culture, we see that in resilience, and Valerie is going to share some examples of what that looked like for specific clients as well.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Thomas, the VP of Consulting here at Denison. It's a pleasure to kind of bring some of this data to life through a client example. But what I'd like to do and start with is by sharing why I chose this particular client. There's a lot of stories out there, but this one I chose to share today for a variety of reasons. And first, they're currently in it. So we're, really in honest conversations around their data, conducting focus groups, and embarking on the action planning process as well. But even more importantly, they're in the public sector, and they were considered a non-essential business. So they experienced firsthand the shutdown, and then partially reopening, and as well as in early 2021, they fully opened. So, and in the midst of all of that, they were able to implement, innovate, build their team and capability, as well as, really staying close to their vision and the mission and serving their customers. So I think it's just a compelling story for a company that really was faced with, kind of front-facing some of the fear and unsettling impact of the pandemic. So what you're seeing here on the screen is and they also took the survey in 2019, and that was their first time. So pretty strong baseline, a lot of balance in their profile. And in the midst of all of that, the shutdown, the reopening, partially reopening, they were able to even enhance their culture significantly. As Michael alluded, they fit that trend of that creating change. Muscle got really, really strong amidst all of that, as well as their ability to manage and coordinate across the organization and empower folks. So, I will tell you more, but as we get into more of the trends and what we're seeing, and I'll tell you more of their story, but they really were able to just face some and unleash some of the innovation that employees across all levels were empowered to kind of not only generate those ideas, but also successfully implement those ideas during all of that. And they also took the resilience. And this is another reason why I chose this client, because while they, fit within some of the trends that we're seeing, this is where they didn't necessarily fit in the trend. And so, I think it's important to be keeping in mind, it's not going to be the same for every organization. They have their unique challenges, their unique strengths. But within the COVID-19 resilience assessment, I think this got their attention. They're still unpacking the why behind some of this, but within our survey, we have some open-ended items around the resilience assessment. And so some of the employees were wanting more from leadership, more updates around the guidelines, and more accountability for keeping each other safe and making sure that the public are being safe. So that whole, being able to, create and do some touch points along the way, I think they communicated really well. And it was a one-way communication, and quite understandably, given the situation. But I think they've learned that, hey, we need more touch points. We need to talk to employees a little bit more and ensure that they feel that they're cared for. And that was one of the things that also was in the employee comments is, they put us top priority, our safety and our well-being, and we feel that they generally care about all of us. And that wasn't just because when they were shut down, they actually decided to pay all of their employees in that period of time. So that also was a key decision, and also demonstrated the value and the care for those staff. And they heard that, they felt that. There was also some dialogue around, we're trying all these new things out to meet our customer needs, especially some of the virtual things that we are now doing. We'd love to hear from leadership. How is that landing? What kind of information are we getting from our customers at this time? And I think that is also, some of the reasons why their scores are so low, in terms of feeling that we're keeping in close contact with our customers. So that's a little bit. I'll get into more after Lauren takes us through some of the item trends.
All right, thank you, Valerie. So while looking at a high level is really important to understand what is going on, or what was happening during 2020 in the midst of the pandemic, we wanted to break it down and look more specifically at what was driving these overall or high level trends that we see. So we looked specifically at items, and we did this a few different ways. The first is by looking simply at just the highest item scores and the lowest item scores across 2020. We see some pretty interesting trends. Some of the highest scores really highlight the need to be flexible, which is what we've talked about, that idea of creating change and being able to do it in a flexible and adaptable way. But what we also found is that doing that with coordination and teamwork is also really important. So you can see that with different parts of the organizations cooperate to create change. It's easy to coordinate projects. The way things are done are flexible. And then again, cooperation across the organization is really important. So in the midst of all this uncertainty, being able to adapt and adapt quickly was important, but also doing it together with a lot of teamwork. We also see that strategy pops in a few interesting ways, with the item of we are able to meet short-term demands without compromising our long-term vision being one of the highest. But we also see that there's a clear strategy for the future was one of the lowest. So what this tells us is that as priorities were shifting really quickly in organizations, they were forced into this survival mode, and they had to address the short-term demands. So how do we either shift to working from home safely, or shift to working on the front line safely and effectively while still meeting some of those short-term demands? So while the future was unclear, getting through the day, the week, the month was kind of the priorities that organizations had to keep as a number one. For some of the lower items, we see core values and capabilities kind of popping again, which is something we've touched on a little bit. So in the midst of all the uncertainty that's going on, keeping core values as the forefront is not a main priority for organizations. They're focusing on surviving, getting through the day. We also see that investing in the development of employees may not have been a top priority either. Again, just trying to get through the day. We also see that customer focus, we encourage direct contact with customers by our people was a little bit lower. Again, during a pandemic, all of the disturbance and guidelines that the pandemic forced upon people meant that keeping in contact with customers was especially difficult. We also wanted to see which items had improved the most when comparing 2019 to 2020. And the item that improved the most was we make certain that everyone is informed about what is going on across the organization. You can see how that changed in the figure below, but what this tells us is that communication was really important. This and the other item of information is widely shared. So that everyone gets the information when needed. Tells us that really communicating with your employees, keeping them informed about what's going on as there are day-to-day changes in the guidelines of how people carry out work was really important. And similarly, we also see that empowerment improved a lot with those three items. So not only informing employees, but also allowing them to engage in making decisions to best protect themselves, given everything that's going on. And then again, we see creating change where it was really important for organizations to be able to bounce forward. So build on those learnings that the pandemic forced upon everyone was also a big improvement from 2019 to 2020. And then lastly, we wanted to see which items fluctuated the most throughout 2019 and then comparing that to 2020. And the first thing that we see is responding to change. So we respond well to competitors and other changes in the business environment. Obviously, during a pandemic, this is crucial. So having an agile response to the disruption in business environment caused a leap of almost 25% from Q1 of 2020 up to Q2 of 2020 as well. We also see consistency fluctuating a lot, and this makes sense. So the pandemic's impact meant that doing business in a consistent way was no longer possible. It's not easy to predict the future when, again, those guidelines and ways of working are changing almost daily, it felt like at some point. We see customer focus pop again, similar to the previous slide that we just talked about, where incorporating and meeting customers' needs fluctuated a lot. Again, we're in survival mode. We're trying to get through the day and the week, and incorporating some of those feedback or comments from customers may not have been at the forefront of people's minds. And then lastly, we also see that ethics and behavior popped and fluctuated a lot. One thing that we would be remiss to ignore is that in 2020, there was a lot of social unrest that was also occurring for various reasons. One of the most salient is George Floyd's death that led to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what this imposed upon employees and organizations is that their core values and their ethics became really salient. So we see that some of those items fluctuated a lot as well. All right, and then with that, I will pass it back to Valerie so she can explain some of the client trends and how those might compare to what we see at the overall level with item trends.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. So here's a little bit more of the story. So this particular client, the core values, you're seeing that, the good news is their managers and leaders are practicing what they preach, even significantly more than they did in 19. They're also seeing a clear set of values that, governs the way that they do business. When people ignore core values, they're held accountable. That got the leadership's attention, and that will be an area of focus, and especially in the focus groups, really kind of unpacking and getting some examples of what's showing up there. But as we, talked about it, a couple of things surfaced even at the leadership level in terms of, I think maybe we haven't equipped our leaders to be able to have difficult conversations, to be able to, resolve conflict and really help, address some of the behaviors that's showing up in our organization that are not acceptable. So rather than just tolerating them, but they did note that, hey, we might need some training and development for our leaders to be able to do that as well. And some examples, it could be anything from, poor behavior to, not following the new guidelines and not wearing their mask. So it was a pretty wide range in terms of what people are seeing, but more to come there. The coordination and integration was a strength for the most part. Pretty significant shift, 27 percentile points. And just to give you gauge, we look at 10 percentile point shifts in either directions to be significant. And what we mean by significant is people can tell you a story. They can point to an example, they can share what shifted. And so 27, that's pretty significant, and it's a positive shift. So really understanding how that happened, I think there is a connection to some of the innovation and new ideas and servicing customers. They were able to kind of build a stronger muscle in coordinating those new model of materials and things that they were providing to their customers, and work more collaboratively and across the functional areas. Creating change, I should have bolded that in red, 31 percentile points, a huge dramatic shift. And I think there's a sense of pride, and I saw it in the employee comments as well, in terms of the organization embraced new ideas. And yeah, some of those ideas weren't the right ideas, and we figured it out pretty quickly, course corrected, and then we're able to get on the right mark. So there was a lot of learning and applying that learning and being able to pivot pretty quickly. But 31 percentile points in terms of the way things are done is very flexible and easy to change. And Michael had mentioned, it's a time where people step up, and I think, this organization, everybody stepped up and really got involved in it, and they were empowered to be able to do that. And so the next slide will show you their empowerment and capability scores. And again, they were already pretty strong here, but they definitely have built even stronger muscles, especially in decisions. Usually are at the level where the best information is. People were able to implement some of their ideas with autonomy. They were getting even stronger at sharing information. The business planning, what the thinking behind that is, we kind of paused the business planning. We were really executing some of the changes. And so that is something going forward. That's another area of focus for them, is to really get back. And it wasn't necessarily a strength, or it was a strength before. And so we want to continue kind of building and fostering that strength moving forward. But I think from their perspective, we pretty much put all energy into implementing new customer innovations. And then while they were doing all of that, they also ensured, and I saw in employee comments that, hey, I got new skills, I got new development so that I could best meet some of the new ideas that we were giving to customers. So they didn't miss an opportunity to continue developing their talent. And outside of this company, I think a lot of companies are struggling with that. A lot of clients are saying, it's all hands on deck. It's focused on, driving and survival, and we'll do development later. It's not all. We've got a lot that are doing a lot of leadership coaching and leadership development, but oftentimes we see that. And, again, that's something that this organization didn't miss a beat, and their employees shared that information in the survey as well. And I think I'll turn it on over to Michael to even go further into the module trends.
Sure. Thanks, Valerie.
Mm-hmm.
So in addition to looking at the culture trends, we also wanted to look at how are these modules changing over time. And for some context, these are 4 of our modules that we offer, which tend to be some shorter surveys that accompany the culture survey. So these 4 examples here are innovation, trust, engagement, and commitment. And we saw some really interesting trends across these 4 modules over the years. So innovation, as you might expect, is that dark purple line that shoots up from just above average to about the highest scores that we've seen on modules, above the 80th percentile, meaning organizations that were taking the innovation module in the last year or so are higher than we've seen over the course of the last decade, essentially, and very high average. And when you think about it, this makes sense. Valerie spoke to that organization had to learn from their improvements, or learn from their failures to improve quickly, to course correct, to try new things and implement new ideas in the face of the disruption that the pandemic caused. And in many cases, what we saw is that's what every organization has been doing, creating change and creating innovation quickly in the face of the pandemic, and changing the way that they work and the way that they reach customers, the way that they develop their capabilities. Innovation became a really important aspect to the response to the pandemic. Trust is that light purple line that you see holding steady from 2019 to 2020, and then taking a dip in 2021 and dipping below average in 2021. So what you see for trust was extremely important, where employees needed to hear from their leadership. Employees needed to hear from each other, and employees needed to see that transparency of how are we responding? What does that mean for you? And are we listening to you? That was strong during the pandemic. In many ways, organizations stepped up. They were extremely transparent. They communicated often. They shared information often. And we saw a slight uptick in trust that reflected that. In 2021, there's a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty that's re-entering the situation, especially in these early months of 2021 when we have the data. And employees are wondering, with the rollout of vaccines, with the future looking like it's going to be the world opening back up, what does that mean for us? Are we still going to be working the way we are today, or is that going to change? Are we going to be forced to go back into the office? Are the policies and procedures we've just gotten used to going to change again as the context, as the environment changes as well? And so there's some uncertainty reflected in those numbers for the trust as well. Employee engagement didn't really move much. We saw some very slight uptick from 2019 to 2020 and again to 2021, but really holding steady throughout those years, reflective of the fact that people's work and the extent to which they were engaged with their organization, it stayed steady. It didn't change much throughout the pandemic. The way they were working certainly would change, but the work itself and their engagement with that work and their engagement with the organization did not. And then commitment, we see is a pretty startling decline there. We see a dip in 2020 compared to 2019, getting close to average in 2020, and then a sharp dip in the beginning of 2021. And this is based on just a handful of organizations, and so it's more anecdotal rather than being robust and representative of the entire population, the entire environment. But we do see this is a trend that, when you think about it, can point to a lot of things. Commitment usually tends to be a predictor or an antecedent of turnover, of people deciding that they want to leave the organization when they have low commitment. And what we see now is, in many ways, employees have been forced to be working long hours, extra hours, working in new ways, changing the way they work. And likely there's some fatigue setting in. We've been asking employees to do a lot for a long time now. And many employees may be at the point where they're starting to look elsewhere because that's been such high stress situation for a long time. Additionally, as we move to a world where remote work is going to be more prevalent than ever, and more jobs are opening up as organizations are recovering from the pandemic and are able to stop that hiring freeze that's been in place and to start adding more people, we're going to see a lot more opportunities arise where people have the chance to work at organizations that are headquartered all across the world. And new exciting jobs are opening up that they can apply to and apply very easily and not have to worry about relocating for a job. And so in many cases, we may be seeing an uptick in that voluntary turnover that's coming as employees start looking elsewhere because they have the opportunity to. During the pandemic, they were probably just thankful they could have a job. And looking forward, we see there are a lot of people on the job market and a lot of jobs opening up. And so we may see that commitment is an area that organizations need to be focusing on to be sure that the people that they have, they can keep them engaged, keep them committed, and keep them happy working for the organization. So with that, those are the main trends that will dive into today. And so the question kind of remains of why are we seeing these trends, and so what do these trends mean for organizations today? And so we've been speaking to these points mainly throughout this webinar so far. Number one at the top of the list, communication and transparency are key during a crisis. We saw that many organizations stepped up, and the items that were jumping up the most and the items that were strongest in 2021 were often those that referred to keeping people informed and communicating. In this case, the top overall item, we make certain that everyone is informed about what is going on across the organization. We saw this same type of theme in our resilience research as well, where to the open-ended item, what are we doing well during the pandemic? The number one theme was always communication and transparency, letting people know what's going on, keeping people informed about what's going on. When there's so much uncertainty and you can't necessarily tell people, here's what life is going to look like in a week or 2 weeks or a month, at least you can tell them, here's what we're grappling with, here's what we're thinking about, here are the decisions that we're making and the information we're using to make those decisions. And that's what was mainly appreciated from employees during this time. In addition to that, adaptability and involvement were those two areas that were more important than ever to enable that flexibility within the organization. The disruption of the pandemic meant that many organizations had to switch the way they worked. And what's important now is moving forward, organizations have to be capturing those learnings from the disruption and designing new ways of working moving forward, and working with employees to make sure that fits what they want moving forward. If that's a return to the office, in some cases that may be necessary. In some cases, you may have thought it was necessary a year ago, but it doesn't seem as necessary now. People have shifted pretty effectively to working remote in many cases. And so understanding what those changes are and how you can integrate those changes into a work model and integrate them into policies about working remotely moving forward is going to be important. And then on the involvement side, what skill sets are going to be important? Again, as this disruption caused change, there are going to be new skill sets that are going to be important to be rolling out and upskilling your employees with. And as these new work models are adopted, it's going to be important to couple that with some capability development, some training for employees of making sure that they're confident working in this new setting. And then as all of this is happening with an adaptability and involvement, we don't want to forget about the core values of the organization. In many ways, survival mode meant turning away from the core values. In some cases, for organizations with strong core values, it could mean rallying behind those. But this is an area that needs to be a focus moving forward, especially in the wake of the social unrest that happened last year and all of the change that's happening. What we saw that just this past week with the attack, the shooting on Asian Americans. Again, these types of things, core values is at the core from an organizational perspective of how you react to these things and how you can have a conversations and dialogue about these things within the organization. And it's so important to not forget about that when you're focused on survival and you're focused on the success of the organization, because this is what will help keep people at an organization. Leaders and managers practice what they preach. Having a set of core values that can guide your behavior is so important. And then from the module perspective, again, similar to adaptability, internalizing the learnings from all of the change that's happened, making sure that the innovations that were started during the pandemic can be optimized and locked into the way people work moving forward, the way that the needs of the customer are met moving forward. And then also considering future voluntary turnover as decreasing commitment might indicate. Employees may be looking elsewhere. And so it's going to be more important than ever to make sure that your employees are content and satisfied with the organization, making sure that you are giving them the capability development that they're asking for, the personal development that they're asking for, making sure that your vision, your strategy is clear and that they can buy into that makes sense to them at a personal level and the work that they do every day. And so those aspects of the work are going to be more important than ever in areas that organizations and leadership need to be focusing on. And again, what do we do with this information? I think number one, it affirms the importance of nurturing culture because organizations need their people to step up in a time of crisis. We had one one client who one of their leaders were speaking to depositing in the culture bank over the years. And then when the pandemic hit, they had to make withdrawals from that culture bank. They had to ask a lot of their people during the pandemic and how they changed the way they work and how often they work, and putting themselves at risk in some cases for essential frontline employees. And culture is at the core of people within organizations. And as long as you're nurturing that culture, as long as you're depositing into that culture bank, then your people, you can expect more of your people during times of crisis for them to step up. And especially moving forward, it's going to be adaptability and involvement that are going to be key areas to focus on. How agile are we, and how are we developing our employees and preparing them for the future of work? And then also making sure that we don't overlook core values in the wake of focusing on survival, in the wake of, and as we come out of the pandemic, focusing on future and on growth and on sustainability, making sure that core values are at the center of that and are something that the organization's talking about on a regular basis. And then also, we've had questions from many clients asking about the validity of the global benchmark. So with all these changes, with all these fluctuations going on, you know, should we still be comparing ourselves to 2019? And in many cases, we do see some aspects of culture are more salient than ever, and some aspects of how people are perceiving those areas are shifting. But the ability to use that global standard is still really valuable. And it's a twofold way. One is determining the in-house trends. So determining how, you know, the organization is excelling in certain areas and needs to be developing other areas. That's still a very important aspect of being able to look at a global benchmark. And then also external comparisons, looking at how you compare to the marketplace. And we'll continue to build out offerings that can meet the needs of the market. And so we're planning on building out a benchmark of only those organizations that have surveyed during the pandemic in 2020 and into 2021, so that that comparison point can be available. But the global benchmark is still a really important aspect of comparison to help set the context and understand where you're at compared to others. So with that, I think we've got some ample time here to hand it back over to Nellie to see what kind of questions that we've had coming in.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, we've gotten a lot of really, really great questions. And before I turn it over to you guys to ask those questions, I did want to mention our upcoming Denison Global Forum. You'll see right here. If you've not had the chance to register, you can scan the QR code above, but we will also provide registration and more info as part of our follow-up to this webinar. As you can see, some of our confirmed speakers include executives from Domino's, Steelcase, Heraeus Medical, Sheets, and Birch Hill Equity Partners. And we look forward to sharing more speakers as they are confirmed in our discussion topics with you in the coming weeks. Yeah, so let's turn it over to Q&A. There was a lot of really, really great questions, and I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we can answer that in our follow-up to you as well if you need. So one question that came up a few times was that Valerie and Michael, you both spoke to organizations seeing a dip in organizational learning and capability development. And is that something that we can expect to see an increase in 2021, increase emphasis on in 2021?
Sure, I'll take that one first. I think capability development and organizational learning are two areas where how people respond to change, how people adapt and build their skill sets in the face of change is really important. Org learning is that side where it happens organically. People are learning from failures and mistakes and continuing to improve. Whereas capability development is more of that intentional side of having training and development opportunities for employees to be building those. And I think that those areas of capability development, especially that intentional training and development that's occurred, is likely going to look a lot different in 2021 than it looked in 2019. As the ways people work has changed, the skill sets they may change. And so those trainings, those development that exist in organizations may need to be revisited and changed. And so I do think that that's going to be an area that's going to be really important to focus on, and organizations will need to be proactive as to what have people been learning throughout this process, particularly from the organizational learning part, as kind of organically as they face this change? What have they been learning, and how can we support that learning with some more hands-on training opportunities? Valerie, would you add anything to that?
No, I echo what you just said, Michael. I think you hopefully answered that question. I guess only one other thought is with organizational learning, my hope is that, communication is a big piece of that, and really taking a moment to celebrate your successes and apply that learning. And so often we just figure out or focus on what's, failing or what's not working. And so I really hope that we can, continue to create that balance around celebrating some of the wins and really applying that as well.
So another question that came up a few times in a few various forms was around our diversity, equity, and inclusion module, and if we've seen any trends in relation to that over the course of the last year, especially as Michael, you mentioned, shifts in core values and how that might be connected to some of the social unrest that we've seen. Is there any data that we can share in relation to that module?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've seen over the past year and a half, essentially, and 2.5 years dating back to 2019, there wasn't a ton of data. It's a fairly new topic for many of our clients, and so we didn't have too much data on it over the course of those years. So a quarter-to-quarter comparison or year-to-year comparison wasn't very robust, and so we didn't include it here. But what we have seen is, in the last 6 months, we've seen a lot more of our clients take us up on that offering. A lot more of our clients start using diversity, equity, inclusion surveys within their organizations to help understand where they're at and help understand where they need to focus moving forward. And so while it's hard to speak to trends of what the data themselves show, we can say that more and more organizations are turning to their diversity, equity, inclusion internally and making sure that that's an area of focus and an area of priority moving forward.
And I guess I have a follow-up that might have been prompted by another question is, do you think that, I know you can't speak to the trends, but do you think that if there's been an increase in utilizing that module, that the core values aspect might change and shift as well in the future?
Yeah, another great question. I think those two areas are closely linked. More often than not, when we do our driver analysis to relate culture to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we do see core values as kind of the #1 area that's popping up there. Leaders and managers practice what they preach. We have an ethical code that guides our behavior. Those types of questions are really important to diversity, equity, and inclusion and how people perceive that. And I do think that those two areas need to be closely related within an organization, whether that means making diversity, equity, and inclusion a core value of the organization, or at least leveraging those core values to have the conversations around that topic and to push that topic forward and push change in that area forward. I think that's going to be really important.
And this might be a question for Valerie, although Michael, I'm sure that you can chime in as well. That although we've seen a lot of really positive trends and organizations reacting and adapting really well to the pandemic, have we encountered any clients whose culture did not react that positively? And maybe we could share how they're starting to rebuild after a really tough year.
Yeah, no, there's so many stories, as I mentioned earlier today, and certainly you'll hear more if you join our forum. And there's also quite a few stories told by our clients on some of our previous webinar series. But great question. And as I think about the clients I've interacted with, I think where some of them have struggled, I think it's a similar trend in terms of the core values. Really being a particular area of focus for them, and I think just the uncertainty in their current business and some of the too many unknowns, and so the mission area also, while the ones I shared with you today, they had pretty high scores, I've seen some that are below the 25th percentile there, and So some of those organizations, while they were in survival mode, are now kind of shifting into let's create, communicate, clarify, and reinforce our mission, our strategy for moving forward, and then identify those long-term and short-term goals. So I think for some, that mission area is becoming a focal point as well.
Right, and I would add to that, the trends we showed today are the average of the organizations we've worked with. And in many cases, they're examples of those organizations where we've been talking about the challenges the pandemic introduced in many ways, but in some cases, the pandemic introduced a lot of opportunity to organizations where demand for certain aspects of their work shot up as the impact of the pandemic had on their business. And so there were cases where there were organizations that were even higher than what we were seeing. And then in many cases, you have that selection bias. You have that bias of only organizations that were in a state where they could be having a culture survey and could be talking to their people were the ones that opted in and the ones that we have data for. We haven't been able to analyze this by industry yet, but I'm guessing there are certain industries that are usually taking culture surveys that weren't over the course of the last year or so. Things like transportation industries, things like restaurants and hospitality. Those types of industries have been hit the hardest and in many ways are not in a place that they can do a culture survey right now, as employees are furloughed or as they're struggling to figure out how they're going to survive. And so we'll be continuing to do this type of research, and hopefully by the forum we'll be able to present some of those more specific findings based on industry and other trends that we're seeing. But in many cases, what we've seen has been positive, but there's plenty that we haven't seen, plenty of organizations we haven't been able to work with that their stories may be very different.
I had one or two questions around the distinctions between engagement and commitment, and if we could theorize or explain how these concepts are similar and different and how they showed opposite trends and why that might be. So Michael or Lauren, Valerie, I'm sure you can also chime in, but if you have any insight into that.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Yeah, in many ways it's counterintuitive. You expect those two things to trend pretty similarly. The more people are engaged with their work and with the organization, you'd expect them to be more committed to the organization as well. The way we think of these at Denison tends to reflect the research around these areas, where engagement is really about expending extra effort in how much you're willing to go further in your job, more than is what is asked by the organization. And so the items in this are about my work drives me the extra mile, or I'm enthusiastic about working for the organization, passionate about my work. Those are the types of questions included with the engagement, and it's really about that discretionary effort. Are you willing to do more and to work, harder to succeed in your role? Commitment, on the other hand, is more about would you recommend the organization to others? Do you often look for jobs elsewhere? And those types of questions. And so in some cases, employees may still be committed to the organization at a high level, but also be thinking about work elsewhere. And many of the situation is the pandemic. There are a lot of hardships that the pandemic put on people. Work-life balance was one of the top ones, where people were struggling to stop work, to put work aside, especially when your office is right next to your kitchen table, or is your kitchen table. It's hard to turn off work. And so those types of situations may have made it more difficult to be strongly committed to the organization and strongly committed to sticking around for longer, even though you were still engaged in the work that you had and the work that you were doing. Valerie, Lauren, anything you would add there?
No, I think you covered it well, Michael.
Yep, I think you covered it very well.
Yeah, that is counterintuitive, though. More often than not, we see those kind of trending in the same direction. So the pandemic is one case where we've seen that it's shifting up the way we've typically seen things. And I'll also note it's also based on far less data than some of the other analyses were when we were looking at engagement and commitment, because only a subset of the organizations use those. So they may be more anecdotal, and in some cases you may see that they're trending in the same way, but that's not what we found for the few cases that we did have.
I have a similar question about two different items, but about the relationship between trust and the drop in trust that we've seen, and the increase in innovation, if we have any insights about why that might have happened.
Yeah, so I'll jump in there too. So that, I think innovation, it's just been a necessary reaction to the pandemic. In many ways, it's not surprising to see that trend line shoot up and be about as high as it's ever been, because in some cases, organizations may have been resistant to change in the past, and making changes may have been very hard, and innovating and implementing new ideas may have been very hard in the past, but it's been necessary to be able to do now. Trust really asks about how trustworthy the organization is. If leaders have the best interest of employees in mind, and if people are honest, and then those types of questions, I wouldn't say they're super strongly related to innovation per se. And so during the pandemic, having the best interest of employees in mind meant looking out for work-life balance, making sure that you're creating an environment where employees can take care of themselves mentally and physically in reaction to the pandemic. And in some cases, we may have seen organizations struggle with that. In other cases, we may have seen them excel. Again, some of the organizations, some of the clients we work with, they implemented pay bonuses, and they implemented more paid time off, mental health days, and things like that, really trying to put the employee first and making sure that they're looking out for employees. Whereas other organizations, as they were trying to survive, those things weren't top of mind. And the mental health, the physical health of the employee may have been something that was kind of secondary to what they were trying to do. Lauren, Valerie, anything to add there?
You guys go ahead. Anything that you wanted to add?
No, I just, trust to me is such a huge topic and has so many layers. And, I think Michael covered the connection there, but there's so much to unpack when we're looking at trust. And so it's definitely, an important key topic. And I think it's, really closely aligned more with the core values, and really, making sure that, you're building that trust through a set of core values and behaviors, and that leaders and managers are modeling those, and employees embrace them as well. But trust deserves another whole hour of time to kind of really uncover that. But thanks for the question.
I think we have time for one more, and I may be wrong, but I think it might be a quickish answer, and that is around the benchmark in future years. So the question is, does 2020 make it harder to interpret when compared with future years?
Yeah, that's another great question. In many ways, we may see 2020 as an outlier of one that looked very different from other years. And in other cases, we may see it as kind of a turning point of an inflection point, where there's a certain trend before 2020, and that trend completely changed when you look after 2020. And adaptability is one of those examples that we'd likely see there. So from a benchmarking perspective, we'll certainly be looking at that closely, and we'll essentially, my philosophy at least, is the more information, the better, so long as people understand that information. And so having a comparison point that's just 2020 and having a broader comparison point that can help set that in context. The benchmarks that we have tend to be spanned over years, over the course of many years too, so that it's fairly stable across those years. And so we'll see if 2020, 2021 and the data moving forward looks a lot different, we may need to be tweaking that, and may need to have a benchmark that's only the last couple of years, so you can compare yourself to what's most recent. It may be less organizations, it may be less robust across industry and region, but and maybe more relevant to, the environment that you're thinking about today.
Well, we've just hit time, so I think we should probably wrap up. But I will say that we will be providing these slides as well as a recording of this presentation as follow-up. And you should be hearing from a member of our team in the next few days with those resources. But I just wanted to say thank you, everyone who took the time to join us. It's been a wonderful session, and thank you to all of our speakers. I really appreciate all your time and energy on this, and we will be talking to you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nellie.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nellie.